Welcome to Sections 2 of the ITH Conference. The topic for this session is International Trade and Health Preparedness for Public Health Threats. This session will discuss the role of both trade and health organizations at the global and national levels in preparing to address the public health threats, including pandemics and climate change. To provide more details, introduce the panelists and moderate these sections, please welcome the moderator for this section, Dr. Liviu Vadrescu, Head of Simulation Exercises and After Action Reviews Unit, Health Security Preparedness Department, World Health Organization. To the stage. Thank you. Please, sir.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. It was so wonderful to be here again after a few years. Thank you for organizers to have me here. And allow me first to introduce the four panelists. I have an additional challenge because we have two panelists physically present with us here, Andrew and Roger. Roger needs no introduction for now. And we have two additional panelists that are joining us online, and I can see at least one of them on my screen in front here. Will I be seeing the other one as well? Is Mr. Ottoman connected as well? Okay, we'll wait a little bit, but let me first do a couple of things until we have all the panelists with us online. First, I will try to explain what we're trying to achieve in the next 80 or so minutes I understand we have left, and what is the major questions we're trying to answer collectively. And then I'll take a few minutes to just set the scene and try to give an outline of what is going on in the world in terms of the shifts that are happening in the preparedness arena and the architecture of pandemic preparedness and other related domains and how they relate to trade. So the session will discuss the role of both trade and health sectors at all levels, global, national, and regional, in preparing to address the future threats to public health. So the key question, really, and it's a lot of continuation from previous session, and there's a lot of suspense. I feel very responsible. Everybody said the second session will be, everything was pushed to the second session. So here we are in the second session. So one of the major theme and key questions is, did we really learn, or did we learn enough during the last 3 years? And are we better equipped if something similar happens soon or not so soon? And the timing is quite important there. So allow me, before I go into the setting the scene, to actually introduce the members of this panel. As I said, Roger Kamp doesn't need introduction, but he's from Hamburg, Germany, and he's been happily living in Switzerland for quite a while, and he has degrees in public administration from École Nationale d'Administration in Paris, and a law degree from Hamburg. We also have with us physically in the room Andrew, who is also not a stranger to many of you, and he participated in these conferences in the past. He's a professor of the Faculty of Law in Monash University, and is a member of indicative lists of panelists to hear WTO disputes, which is relevant to this conference. He's published extensively, and he has law degrees from Melbourne, Harvard, and Cambridge. Quite a combination. Welcome to this panel. We have two panelists joining us online, And we are very lucky. In this panel, we have a very wide representation of different sectors. We have academia, with Andrew, we have civil society, and we have international organizations. We have two panelists from WTO. So representing the civil society is Mr. Ottoman Meluk. I am sorry if I'm not pronouncing the last name exactly correctly. He's an expert in the field of access to medicines in developing countries, and I hope he joined us online. Can the colleagues confirm that he's online with us? Not yet. He's not online with us yet. He's a member of several international committees, and he ensures the voice of civil society is heard and has specific expertise in the area of access to medicines. Also with us online, and I did see him, he's in Geneva. He didn't have to wake up too early, but he's there in the office. His name is Devin McDaniels, and he serves as Economic Affairs Officer at WTO in its Trade and Environment Division since 2011. And he serves also as the Deputy Secretary of WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, and he has degrees in economics, international relations, and environmental policy from universities of British Columbia and Oxford. So welcome to all of you to this panel. And allow me to now set the scene and try to explain, or not explain, that at least touch on a few points of what is going on in the world in terms of the world, the organization, the civil society, the academia, trying to digest all the learnings, not always learned, but at least some documented, and make sense of it. So if I could have the few slides I had there, if you can put it on display, that would be great. Or so how we're learning from this devastating impact of COVID. Just a few numbers. These numbers are estimates, and some of you may have seen them before, some not. The 8 million deaths from COVID, this is the deaths reported. The excess mortality is very controversial, and I mean, there are different numbers thrown in, from 12 million to something a little bit higher. The economy, again, 16 trillion. This is one of estimates. I think there are many more speculations of how big that impact is. And education, with 1.6 billion students that were out of school during the pandemic, and the impact of that, I mean, that's lots of PhDs to be done there to estimate that. But another interesting graph on the other side is that the graph that you see, the SARS-1 back in 2003, and other pandemics and Ebola. And as you can see, these pandemics are increasing in frequency. The once in 100 years events seem to be happening more often. So we'll have to find different names for them. And they are compounding. They're compounding and interrelated. And in the bottom, you perhaps cannot see there, but there is other pandemics that we cannot quite forget, and they have still an impact. HIV is still with us, TB is still with us, malaria is still with us, and cholera, I mean, it doesn't make the headlines right now, but it's a major crisis right now in the world. So the magnitude is growing, and in addition to all of this, you have all the conflicts, all the wars, and another 300 million people that are in need of humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance appeal was just launched the other day, and the needs are only growing. So in response to this, and in the first, if you remember, the first year of the pandemic, there was, in addition to the pandemic, there was an epidemic of reports and commissions and committees and recommendations. So there was someone in WHO actually put them together in a database. There's over 300 substantive recommendations how to fix the world and how to fix the sort of preparedness architecture. And in response to this, the WHO, with its member states, put all of this into a package, the so-called 10 proposals to build a safer world. And I'm not going to go into the great details, but some of the highlights of this you've heard. There is a talk about the treaty or other legal instrument for pandemics. And this was a proposal by the President of the European Commission, but then more and more states are behind, and now we are at the conceptual zero draft phase, which is a third draft of this document, and it's only growing. We have pandemic fund set up at the World Bank with a strong participation of WHO. We have something that many of you have not heard, is Universal Health and Preparedness Review, which is a mechanism to sort of monitor the implementation of a treaty that yet doesn't exist, but we're already piloting it. So there are many things happening here, and there are these 10 proposals. In addition to the pandemic treaty, there is the modifications to the international health regulations. That is a parallel process going on. So lots to digest, lots to make sense of. Sometimes very difficult, and now we are coming to the intersection of the sort of called the trade regime. I'm learning new language here. Trade regime and the international health regulation regime, and how do this work together, and how are they complementary or not contradictory? And so here I just extracted from all these measures, from the capacities, from one of the core capacities, access to countermeasures. So the access to countermeasures of the 5 C's is community participation and cooperative surveillance, many other things I will not go into, but the access to countermeasures is most relevant to our discussion in this panel, and the panelists will address some of this. But what is proposed in this great architecture that is going to be proposed to the World Health Assembly in 2023 in May. So there are at least 3 major areas. One is research and development, and the previous panel talked about that. Scalable manufactured platforms, and emergency manufacturing capacity in regions that can be scaled up, as well as coordinated supply and emergency distribution. And I think, Roger, you mentioned that having that database, having that platform where manufacturers and governments alike can see what's going on in terms of production and procurement. So I will end here, and we'll go straight to Roger, and I will bring the device, and my microphone is not traveling with me, okay? If you don't mind, I'll move it. Okay, we change. This one, okay. So, Roger, if you could please reflect on World Trade Organization's response to the COVID pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, and in particular, perhaps if you could highlight some key things from the pandemic declaration and the TRIPS decision that was adopted in 2022. And as you discuss this and reflect on this, if you can say, perhaps, or think about it, what surprised you the most during the last 3 years? What things you were expecting to happen, and what things completely thrown you off your chair? And how optimistic are you about the pandemic treaty and its elements, trade and health elements? I will come back with the same question, so the floor is yours.
Perhaps I was going to say, leave you perhaps at the end of what I'm going to present now, you can remind me of those last 2 questions. I stand here not only because I like standing, but also I thought it's useful for this to actually give you a short presentation, which will start with a slightly different angle, just recalling what were the challenges when we ran into the pandemic. And these are not only past, but also present and future challenges. And not running through the entire list, just to point out what is actually guiding so much of our discussion today is about manufacturing capacities and about enabling transfer of know-how and technology. So that links directly to what is, I think, one of the important questions in this, the development of partnerships as we saw them during the COVID-19 pandemic and also beyond. And I thought, actually, given that the audience is mostly from Thailand, I should have a quick look together with you at the situation in Thailand. And if you can start with therapeutics, I believe there are a total of 7 in Thailand which have an emergency use authorization. I would like to focus here on the 2 main treatments, Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, and walk you through the situation as is. So for those 2, as you know, the originator companies have actually provided a license to the Medicines Patent Pool, MPP, in Geneva, which in turn has sub-licensed generic manufacturers, which are authorized to supply so-called covered territories. Now, for Paxlovid, Thailand is not in that category of covered soft territories. It is since July 2022 for Molnupiravir. In terms of licensing, my information says that Paxlovid is not something where you have a generic manufacturer in Thailand, which is authorized by MPP to manufacture. And I haven't found any reports about plans to actually engage in this generic production. What is more interesting, perhaps, is the situation on the other side, Molnupiravir, where, again, there's no MPP sub-licensee in Thailand, but the government pharmaceutical organization has developed its own product called Monovir with the Schulaborn Research Institute, has no license agreement with the originator company, but has started local production and distribution since last month, actually. At the same time, the GPO is also responsible for the procurement of the originator product. So it's interesting to see they have a double role here to play. And also interesting to note that the prices for the originator product dropped from $280 to $20. So interesting developments in Thailand. Also for the patent side to the story, because you have patent filings, Pfizer for Paxlovid, but also MSD, which has filed its patent for Molnupiravir. But what I found surprising, likewise, the GPO has filed a patent application for Monovir. So where does this leave us? I think it's a question mark. What is interesting, as I assess the situation right now, we actually now have 3 sources of access to Molnupiravir. One is the originator product. Second is the GPO of manufacturing. And then, of course, because Thailand is part of the MPP license covered territories, any generic manufacturer from third countries could also supply a generic version of Molnupiravir to the Thai market. On the vaccine side, my understanding is there's local manufacturing agreements which are in place, which involve technology transfer. One is AstraZeneca with CM Bioscience. Interestingly, not only for local production, because 70 million doses, and Ambassador, you mentioned exports. It's a minor fraction, but there's also exports of this local production to neighboring countries. Now, what I think one can say for Thailand is indeed access mostly relied on bilateral donations and supplies. And this is actually, I asked Affinity to pull together some data, which I thought were interesting in the sense of this slide very clearly shows what I think, again, you, Ambassador, have said in the previous session. there's been hardly any access to COVID-19 vaccines in the first half of 2021. But then there was a massive take-up in terms of supply of those vaccines, mostly from AstraZeneca, as we moved on throughout 2021 and 2022. Now, the next slide shows that in total, Thailand has received some 172 million doses of vaccines, of which 143 million doses were administered as of September last year. And you also see this plateauing of both supply and demand as of April, I think, 2022, which leaves Thailand with the same situation as I mentioned the example of Switzerland, other countries where there's now an oversupply of vaccines as compared to the doses which are needed and used on the local market. Now, so much about development partnerships and the situation in Thailand. This slide is just very briefly to show you the situation as was about a year ago. This is taken from the UNICEF dashboard to just highlight what you see here as green spots on the world map is actually indicating contractual arrangements which involve production with technology transfer. And then you have the blue spots, which are contract production, which are mainly located in high-income countries. Why? Because you typically, for example, the ingredients for the Moderna vaccine are produced in Switzerland by Lonza. I mean, there's no technology transfer involved in that particular production. And this is, I think, the typical situation in the originator home countries. Also interesting, you will not understand this slide until you see it on your screen. Just look at the colors. I thought it's a very telling story. What you see in the center of all of those stars are the originator companies of vaccines. And the colors actually indicate development partnerships they have put in place with companies either in high-income countries, and these are the blue lines and dots, or with manufacturers in either low-income countries, this is yellow, or middle-income countries, this is green. And so you can see that most of the cooperation actually for the originator companies from high-income countries took place with high-income partners. And likewise, you do see that cooperation at the level of low and middle-income countries actually took place mostly with partners from the same level of development countries. Just to give you some ideas in terms of what the data we are which are brought to our attention tell us, the Association of International Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, IFPMA, actually has data about COVID-19 vaccines saying that there have been over 380 manufacturing deals, and 88% of those involve technology transfer, and for therapeutics, over 140 collaborations with 92% involving tech transfer. In the TRIPS Council, we have, of course, all of this as an ongoing debate, and there was a recent communication from Mexico and Switzerland, which has similar data about the number of licensing agreements for therapeutics, and also tells us that there are about 190 manufacturing sites for those worldwide. Now, as I think the ambassador has already outlined, there's no clear position in terms of IP, are they a barrier or not to accessing technology to manufacturing. There's, of course, the other side to the story, if you like, and this goes back to a communication from the main sponsors, as Ambassador referred to, as India and South Africa, but also others, which basically say, okay, it's all very nice. We have these sort of agreements, we have voluntary collaboration, but yet this type of voluntary licensing practices is limited and exclusive, and it's actually not leading to the level of technology sharing which we would hope for, and therefore limits the scaling up of manufacturing capacity. So different views out there in terms of the role of intellectual property rights. One final sort of statistics, which is, I think, an interesting one, which goes beyond COVID-19. This is the Access to Medicines Index, which came out just before Christmas, and which analyzes the 20 major R&D pharmaceutical companies with products for high burden disease in low and middle income countries, and which notes that there is indeed an increased engagement in voluntary licensing from June 2020 to May 2022. Yes, of course, this is driven by COVID-19, but interestingly, the observation is that this actually goes beyond COVID-19, and we do see this voluntary licensing practice now also spreading into non-communicable diseases. And one example here is, I think, the Novartis non-exclusive voluntary license to the medicines patent pool for what is a leukemia medicine. Now, I finally get to what I should be speaking about, the sort of outcome of the WTO's ministerial conference last June, and what I would capture with the term WTO's pandemic response. And first, we actually have the so-called pandemic declaration, and that provides an authoritative overview of the full array of areas where the WTO's coordination role will be critical, while also expressly recognizing our role as the Secretariat as a source of analysis and technical assistance, and its wide array of productive partnerships with other international organizations, in particular the World Health Organizations. It does call for an expeditious solution with regard to a wide range of issues covered by WTO agreements, and this is not only about intellectual property, but it includes issues such as export restrictions, well, all the issues we mentioned in the previous session. So a wide range of issues involved in this. Now, where I think it's interesting, this declaration actually mandates WTO bodies to analyze the lessons learned and based on members' proposals. So this is a process which should be up and running by now, and I'll come back to this in my concluding remarks. The second important point here is it also mandates the WTO to work with the WHO in particular, but also other international organizations on an international pandemic response. So this is one part of the sort of pandemic response. The second is what we've already heard about from the ambassador, and which I would call the TRIPS COVID-19 vaccines decision. And with all due respect, I really want to stick to this term and not call it a TRIPS waiver decision. Why? Because that was the initial proposal by South Africa, India, and many others, 65 WTO members actually. They did propose indeed a TRIPS waiver. Now this is different because it's much more limited, so it clarifies and certain aspects and includes one particular very narrow waiver. So this is why I use a slightly different denomination. Now what does this decision do? It provides a platform for members to work together to overcome potential IP barriers to expanding and geographically diversifying COVID-19 vaccine production, with a view to promoting access and resilience. To do this, it creates an additional streamlined avenue for developing country members to export production of generic vaccines to members in need without the requirement for those needs to be communicated in advance. It also addresses several issues that some members identified as hindering their pandemic response, in particular when expeditiously authorizing the use of patented technology without the consent of the right holders, while maintaining all of this within the multilateral IP framework. So it's actually something a point I make when the industry sort of comes to us and wants to discuss this decision. It's actually sort of a positive development, I believe, that this stays within the existing IP regime, so it's not moving outside as has been proposed at some stage. So in terms of maybe just to move to the follow-up, and this is what you find on the slide here, as the ambassador has said, this decision was explicitly limited to COVID-19 vaccines. Now, this is why I imported this also into the title for this slide. There have been mandated negotiations. According to the decision, members will decide on its extension to cover COVID-19 therapeutics and diagnostics. The deadline for this was 17 December of last year, but members were not in a position to agree on a decision, and therefore the General Council, as recommended by the TRIPS Council, agreed to extend this deadline. A new date for this extended negotiation is yet to be fixed and by the General Council meeting in early March. Now, just to highlight one important difference when we speak about vaccines and when we speak about diagnostic and therapeutics. The difference, I think, one of the sensitivities is very often treatments are of multiple purpose use. So vaccines were very clear. COVID-19 vaccines were to be used for one specific purpose. Here, we could possibly face situations where the treatments are also used for other diseases. So it makes the whole discussion very different from what we've seen in the course of last year. And also, and this is, I believe Andrew will speak to this in detail, of course, this decision is not self-executing. As I said before, it's all very nice to have flexibilities enshrined in the TRIPS agreement or elsewhere. You need to reflect at national level what to do with those flexibilities, how to use them most effectively at national level, and what practical steps are needed to finance, establish, and commission the necessary vaccine production capacity under this mechanism. A few words, Livio, and then I'll come to the end about what is you mentioned the IMB process, and what I learned, I didn't know what this conceptual zero draft actually was, which is a sort of precursor to what will become the zero draft of a pandemic instrument to be circulated on 1st of February. But what we saw actually in December at the meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body was a text which includes a number of trade-related elements. And I've given you a list here which is not comprehensive, and I won't run you through all of those, but there's a provision talking about building and sustaining global supply chain and logistics networks, but there's also one which deals with technology transfer and manufacturing capacity. And in there, interestingly, you have a draft which refers to taking measures to support time-bound waivers of intellectual property rights that are a barrier to manufacturing during pandemics. Now, there are conditionalities in there. As I told you, there's already a difference of views in terms of are intellectual property rights a barrier to manufacturing. So you can expect that, this would be a point of discussion, what actually falls into this. But then I think more generally speaking, this point in particular, but also other points, raises sort of questions in terms of its relationship to existing agreements. And again, this is, I believe Andrew will speak to this in more detail, but you do have in this conceptual zero draft a provision which addresses this point and which says in particular that the instrument shall not affect rights and obligations deriving from other existing international instruments, to continue, shall respect the competencies of other organizations, and what I think is interesting, appropriate steps will be taken to avoid duplication and promote synergies, compatibility, and coherence. Now, when you begin reading this article, it seems to be clear. When you end reading this article, it seems to open the door towards what could be, at least areas of overlapping sort of activities. This is an ongoing process. We are at a very early stage, so it's very difficult at this stage to say, what will be in the end retained in terms of trade-related elements. But what I think, and this will be part of my concluding remarks, what is interesting to note is, I think as a result of the pandemic, we have seen a considerable push for more cooperation as a result. And this is not only the WTO Pandemic Declaration, which talks about collaboration, cooperation, and technology transfer and manufacturing capacities, which is part of cooperation. But this is also enshrined in what is the INB's conceptual zero draft. So this push is clearly there from different angles. What I said in the previous session, at this stage, I believe it's very important not to lose what we've actually created during the pandemic. There are collaboration networks at the level of companies. Those seem to function well in many cases. We shouldn't lose that. We have worked extensively on information resources. They risk just being sort of left aside, dying, without any updates anymore. It's a lost opportunity. I think COVAX at a certain moment in time has created some sort of matchmaking platform so that those with surplus ingredients could actually find manufacturers who need those ingredients and sort of ship them to those so that the products actually could be brought to markets. All these are wonderful sort of achievements, but if we don't build on them, we risk losing them. So that for me is an important point. Now, for WTO members, I think what is important, and I hope the ambassador agrees with me, they really need to contribute to the work which was mandated by the WTO Pandemic Declaration. And I mean, in the TRIPS Council, to speak frankly here, we did not have a single proposal so far on which that discussion could take place. So that, I think, is clearly something where governments need to come in and help implementing the declaration so that it does become an effective response to future pandemics. Of course, we have the pending decision on the TRIPS of COVID-19 decision, the extension. That I think is also an issue which needs to be settled. And then at the domestic level, as I said, there needs to be a consideration, needs to be given to implementing and using TRIPS policy options. And then for us as international organizations, given that we have parallel work streams, and I didn't even mention the one in WHO, which also deals with intellectual property, so flexibilities and waivers, which is the working group on the international health regulation amendments. So parallel work streams within the WHO, and then with also the work at the WTO. We need to ensure coherence and sort of adopt an inclusive approach which builds in on each other's sort of experience. And as you said, Ambassador, I think we need to provide data and evidence, because we also hate discussions which take place in abstract and are not evidence-based. So that is something we will sort of continue to invest in. And of course, we are sort of trying to assist as much as possible, including through what is the trilateral cooperation with WHO and WIPO, to assist members to deal with this and future pandemics in the most effective way. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Something, or it's okay? You are pushing something. Great. Thank you, Roger. I think this was a wonderful overview, and you also had some optimistic notes and some things that were actually worth building on and maintaining and not losing, so we don't enter the cycle of I forgot what that cycle is, the neglect and forget and neglect, and I think also some caution that you bring is very, very relevant. I do remember after every other major outbreak. There is some good initiatives, and everybody gets excited for a couple of years. Ebola, West Africa, and the wonderful things that came out of bird flu. The whole bird flu brought so many interesting things in 2005, 2006, the whole influenza virus sharing agreements. And then there was a little bit of needed peace, but sometimes that peace makes us forget and move on too fast. So thank you, and I will come with some other questions later on. Right now we have two panelists online, and one of them has conflicting appointments, and we'll let him go first. David McDaniels is from a colleague of yours from WTO, and he will come and share with us some key points from the WTO report on trade and climate change. As you probably know, we are here as a side event to the main conference, the Prince Mahidol World Conference, that has the theme today, climate change and health, or not today, but this year. And climate change is one of those, I don't want to call it silent emergencies, but it's definitely not silent, but somehow, yes, humans have the ability to normalize things and get on with life, but it does cause devastation, disasters, and it has huge implications on health. And there is an angle with trade and health, and Devin will tell us all about it. David, the floor is yours, and sorry for mispronouncing your name. Over to you.
No, thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Indeed, I'd like to touch a little bit on some of the connections between trade and climate change and health, but also I will discuss a bit more broadly and maybe fill in some of the things that Roger already spoke about, especially in the area of the sort of dimension of regulations and standards, which is also a core part of the learning that we had actually during the pandemic, and the way that members engaged in the WTO work during the pandemic was very much focused. Of course, IP is very important, but what we heard from members and also from industry as well is that the regulatory dimension of improving more coherence, facilitating, including using the types of tools that the WHO has established for this purpose was so extremely important during the pandemic. But maybe just to start out, I'll just say a few brief words about the connection with climate change and pandemics. And I think this is a very broad topic, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but I just want to sort of introduce some of the connections that we see potentially between how we can address the climate crisis. As the ambassador spoke earlier in the previous panel, climate change is, of course, one of the major priorities, I think, and one of the topics that's going to be the future of trade, of the trade regime and trade negotiations, and certainly something that is a major priority for our Director General, Dr. Ngozi. So climate change and trade is a very important issue. Of course, also a contentious issue, because you have questions about equity, about development, about historic responsibility for the climate crisis, and how that connects with the economic interconnectedness that we have today. But I think maybe as a general, I'll just make sort of 3 points about the connection between trade, climate change, and pandemics. The first one is, of course, that climate change, as we know, is a contributing factor to the emergence of pandemics. And so we know that as we have, shifting, as a result of climate change, we have more frequent and intense weather events and extremes. And these types of things will have naturally health consequences. And so this higher variability also has impacts on things like agriculture with crop losses. And then also this leads to also sort of risks and disease vectors around plants and animals, and human populations. So this connects as well with the risk of higher frequency of zoonotic pandemics that may become indeed more frequent due to a number of factors, including climate change and environmental degradation and the sort of intense, highly industrialized agriculture that we see today in many parts of the world. So climate change is part of one of the risk factors, I think, that was presented by our moderator in one of his first slides, showing that it's no longer once in 100-year events. We're seeing them happening more and more, pandemics, and certainly climate change is part of that, and part of one of the contributing factors to that, as bringing humans more into contact with animal species and environmental challenges. So then we can my next point would bring it into the trade angle. So certainly if we think about the role of trade and trade facilitation in particular, it can help to combat, of course, it can help to address climate change and also to combat pandemics. So I think one thing that we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's something that the other speakers have already mentioned, is the importance of trade facilitation in supporting resilience of supply chains. And I think that same type of logic and point also applies when we're thinking about climate-related shocks, natural disasters that we may be facing in the future. So we have to think that making sure that the trading system and trade facilitation is working and supply chains are working smoothly, so that in times of emergency and in disasters and also in pandemics, we can quickly move essential inputs and goods like food, medical supplies, equipment to respond to disasters. So that's something I think important to keep in mind. And my third and final point on the link between trade and climate change and pandemics is to say that trade as well is part of the solution to climate change, and therefore can help us perhaps to address some of those risks around pandemics. So through trade, we know that, of course, trade creates emissions, like all economic activity. It leads to greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's one dimension of trade. But of course, there's another very important dimension, which is that, through trade, we can disseminate technologies, low carbon technologies, and we are also able to countries are able to access new markets and value chains for low carbon products. So trade is part of the shift. It helps to support the shift towards a net zero, more low carbon world that we are seeing today. And so that I think through those types of effects, through being able to access low carbon technologies, to foster competition and reach scale, trade plays an important role in helping countries better prepare and respond to climate shocks and have the right technology and goods and services that they need in those types of contexts. And then if we think in the longer run, as we integrate more and use trade tools, this can help the longer term impacts of adapting to climate change as well. So it's not only about mitigating climate change, but also adapting to climate change, because that will be, of course, essential in particular for developing and least developed countries. And so as trade can be part of the solution to climate change, it can also support and hopefully help to lower the risk of pandemics in the future. So I think perhaps I will stop there. And if there is additional time later, I unfortunately will have to go quite soon. But if there was additional time, I'd be happy to also share a little bit more about the regulatory cooperation dimension and how that also was an important part of how governments responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you very much, and thank you for making the time. We understand your constraints. But perhaps before you leave us, and you can stay as long as you can, if you can perhaps highlight a few concrete instruments or some tools that governments have at their disposal, or some tools that are not yet developed, but the WTO is developing to exactly help them in this intersection of trade and climate change? You mentioned a few of them, but is there something concrete off the shelf or something in preparation that governments could be encouraged to apply?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of different initiatives and being taken by WTO members and tools and opportunities that are available. I think perhaps just to say that today we have different groups of members that are working together on different aspects of trade and climate change in the context of both the Committee on Trade and Environment of the WTO, but also we have an initiative on the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, where members there are discussing things like how to enhance cooperation on trade-related climate measures, how to better promote dissemination of low-carbon technologies. So I think those discussions are a very important opportunity. Another aspect which I think is quite important is thinking about how to further use the trading system to bring down the cost of fighting climate change. And one of the important ways of doing that is through looking towards liberalizing trade in environmental goods and services. So this means countries getting together and finding ways to lower their import duties or their tariffs on the technologies. It could be solar panels, it could be wind turbines, it could be any range of environmental technologies and their inputs. And by lowering the trade barriers that apply to these green technologies, you can make them more competitive on the market and allow them to be better, to spread more widely across the world. And I think that's an important thing that our also Director General Ngozi has been speaking about, and she mentioned in Davos last week. Another important aspect I think that our Director General is talking about is how do we reduce the risk of fragmentation around trade and climate change? Today we see that there is a growing number of countries implementing different types of carbon pricing approaches, including border adjustments for those carbon pricing arrangements. And in addition, we see that there's quite a wide diversity of different types of standards and regulations that apply to products for carbon content. And when there's this diversity, this fragmentation, it makes it more costly for us to make the necessary changes to our economies that we need to really fight climate change. So bringing everyone on the same page and working together to iron out those differences, I think is also something that is an opportunity that's available to governments today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think these are very important concrete examples that are very useful in these discussions. And I think you mentioned fragmentation. Fragmentation is a syndrome that is common to many areas and domains and governments and institutions. So I think that's something that we don't have a cure, but maybe a vaccine is under development somewhere. I don't know. But since you were discussing, I was also thinking about the other important aspect that also requires many different actors to work together, and that is One Health. And there is a quite tripartite agreement right now, and I was wondering to what extent, and you don't have to answer, just bring it up, to what extent WTO is sort of part of those discussions that are between WHO and FAO and the new acronym of the OIA, which now is WAHO or something like that. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, and recently joined by United Nations Environmental Program. But I think they're grappling with some of the same issues. So thank you so much, and we understand you have to run, so stay and listen as much as you can. We will move now to the second panelist joining us online, and I actually don't know his physical location, which in nowadays we've worked from home, work from Ireland, work from everywhere. It's not so relevant, but he will let us know. Ottoman Meluk, I have introduced you and your background, your area of expertise before you joined us. So be assured everybody knows all the great work you're doing. So if you could please reflect in a few minutes on the role of the civil society in advancing the international trade and health agenda, and especially if you could think of the last 3 years and what was the greatest impact that the CSOs engagement were able to achieve in the last 3 years, and perhaps also what were the greatest barriers or what were the most blatant exclusions of CSOs from various discussions that the CSO should have been at. So the floor is yours, Ottoman.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I wish I would have been able to be with you in person, but unfortunately I couldn't. So yes, I am from Morocco, but currently I am temporary in France, so for other commitments. So this is where I am. It's a morning here for me. And thank you for involving me in this discussion and giving me the opportunity to put some civil society and community input in the discussion. So if we reflect on the past 3 years, I think despite this unprecedented pandemic, we have continued to do business as usual and looking after product by product strategies and not take, the opportunity to rethink the system and to make sure that we don't rely only on short-term solutions and make sure that we put in place systems in place that may prevent we get in these situations. I think Mr. Kampf from WTO mentioned, the role of voluntary licenses, and he also highlighted, for example, the example of Thailand, who has been excluded or who is excluded from some licenses. So voluntary licenses, for me, it's a kind of misery hiding system to avoid we address the real issues. We have the experience of such voluntary licenses from other epidemics like HIV, TB, viral hepatitis, and unfortunately, this may work in some countries, and even I'm not sure, but these exclude several middle-income countries from the territories of these licenses. These licenses also benefit only to few producers, mainly from India or China. And we have seen with this pandemic the danger of relying on few suppliers in the world. We have seen what happened when India banned exports of some medicines during their outbreak. We also remember the problems of logistics and the supply chain with the epidemic, where it was very complicated, very expensive, and taking too much time, to export medical products. So I think what is important is really that we diversify the sources of production and supply. And I think it is very important to make sure and to support local and domestic production everywhere this is possible. I think we have a lot of developing countries who have good capacity of production, but unfortunately, these are still underused today. Also, one lesson of the pandemic is, frankly, I have been working on IP and access to medicine for past 15 or 20 years. And if somebody asked me a few years ago, let's imagine we are in a pandemic, we shut down schools and we close everything and people stay at home and we ban travel and we stop the economy or whatever, are we going to really discuss the possibility to use the flexibilities, to overcome IP barriers? I will have to tell you for sure, everybody will agree on that. We see how disappointing the international response, especially with the discussion related to the TRIPS waiver, which end up not to be really a TRIPS waiver. And I agree with the previous speaker who said that we should not call it like this. And the unwillingness of pharmaceutical industry, to self-regulate itself and to come up with solutions. So we've seen that there has been technology transfer, but on the vaccine field, but mainly to other high-income countries, just to ensure they have enough volumes to export to rich countries. And we see how poor countries, and especially my continent, Africa, has been left behind, and it was very complicated to get doses. So I personally think relying on this, the global response or the industry response, etc., is really a big mistake. And I think it's at national level where some work needs to be done. And civil society should, broadly, I'm not speaking only about, community groups, but if we take really civil society in the wide sense, should be involved in these discussions. We have seen some good examples. In our consortium, our work, we have filed more than 16 patent oppositions on key COVID medicines. Some of them have been successful and led to market entry of generics. I think one example is Thailand with favipiravir. Some countries didn't wait, for the waiver, etc., and they used the existing flexibilities. I'm thinking about Russia and Indonesia on remdesivir. This allowed, market entry, production, and even exports in the case of Russia to other countries. So I think the role of civil society and the responsibility of the governments to use these flexibilities is very important. And I think it's at national level that some interesting solution can come from. And the role of civil society in this is very important because we know that there is still some misunderstanding. Some governments are reluctant to use the existing flexibilities, and there is a lot of policy incoherence between sometimes ministries of health, ministry of industry or trade, etc. And there is some work that needs to be done. And we do have some good examples of countries who are actually reforming their laws and policies. One last maybe important point is that there is, with the COVID pandemic, some good discussions that are happening at country level and sometimes at regional level on how to boost domestic productions, how to increase self-sufficiency when it comes to medical products and, preserve health sovereignty. So we do have some global or regional initiatives, including in Africa. We have the WHO mRNA hubs. We have the manufacturing plans in Africa, etc. The problem is that civil society is not really engaged in these processes. Things happen very fast in a period where there were a lot of restrictions on the work of civil society. And very often this has been handled, by governments without real discussions. And these plans raise a lot of questions. Who is driving this agenda? Is it really nationally driven, or it's coming from institutions, etc.? What products to focus on, or what platforms? What should Africa produce today? Is mRNA the most important thing for Africa now, knowing Africa still exports its the region in the world with the highest burden of HIV, of TB, and we are still importing the majority of our medicines from Asia. what technology transfer, who is doing this technology transfer, and very importantly, how to manage IP if we want to boost local production. Are we going to produce only old products that are of medicines? Are we going to produce medicines with maybe a higher value that are more recent and maybe patented? Are we going to rely on are we going to rely on voluntary licenses or use other flexibilities? So I think this discussion should happen at country level. And civil society, but also, academicians, etc., have not been really involved in discussions. I fear that in some plans, and maybe I will end with the example of Morocco. So we have a plan between the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Industry, to boost local and the generic manufacturers, the Moroccans, to boost local production. The discussions have really increased during the COVID because of the sovereignty issues. But unfortunately, these plans are really designed from the industrial perspective. There is a lot of discussions how to make the Moroccan industry get the biggest part of the pie of the African market, but there is no discussions that are really access focused from an access perspective. So I think it is very important to, this discussion of local production is very important, but we need to have some serious debates. Voluntary licenses are welcome and are good when these help. But maybe one of the harm of the relying on voluntary licenses only, and we've seen it in the majority of sub-Saharan Africa, is that there is almost, maybe with the exception of South Africa, there is no discussions on reforming IP system, on using TRIPS flexibilities, etc., because we think that voluntary licenses are solving the problem. Until now, most HIV drugs or TB drugs are made, through voluntary licenses by Africa, but this doesn't serve, the local production, and it's we mainly rely, on Chinese or Indian companies. So I will end up with this. These are a kind of thought.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Ottoman. And thank you for adding the civil society voice and for finding the time and joining us from Morocco via France. You raised some very important and not easy questions. It's a long list of questions. They are not philosophical questions. They're very concrete questions that leaders will have to address around the world. And I just highlight a few things that you brought up, that you insisted on the voluntary licensing, that is really, in your opinion, not addressing the root causes, and perhaps is only partially addressing the issues. And you highlighted the need for accelerating the technology transfer and diversifying the sources of supplies and promoting local production. And I also note that you were, as many others, disappointed with the global community's response to the pandemic. And another important thing that I took from your intervention is that most of solutions and most of the impacts that civil society can make is at the national level, and to helping in shaping the national policy agenda and making all the different actors in the country, because we are still in a nation-state world. We have not moved beyond that, and perhaps not in our lifetime we will see the next iteration of how humans organize themselves. So the nation-state and the role of civil society mostly is easier and more impactful in countries and more difficult and challenging at the global level in these discussions. And now we come to Professor Andrew Mitchell, and I introduced you already. You have a distinguished law career and academic career. Could you please highlight for us in this panel the core elements on the latest report entitled Practical Means of Applying TRIPS Agreement Flexibilities to promote vaccine production? And what do you think the impact of this report and its recommendations will be on shaping various instruments like the treaty or other things and spill over beyond the vaccines? So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the organisers very much for the invitation to participate in the conference. So my presentation today is based on a report that I prepared with Tony Torben, and which was published by UNESCO, and the URL for that report is on this slide, and so the report's freely available there. So about 2 decades ago, WTO members responded to concerns about potential obstacles to access to medicines that were posed by the WTO trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or the TRIPS agreement, or TRIPS, by the consensus adoption of the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS agreement and public health, or the Doha Declaration. Now, among other things, the declaration identified several policy options or flexibilities that were open to WTO members to be able to leverage access. And faced with the current pandemic, the acute concerns about potential IP obstacles have led several WTO members, as we know, to press for a temporary waiver of certain obligations under the TRIPS agreement. Others have called for clarification or for reinforcement of existing policy options and flexibilities under the TRIPS to override the exclusive effect of IP rights in the public interest. And a complex matrix of overlapping regional trade agreements and economic agreements is a source of further IP protection standards that may affect vaccine manufacture and different distribution options. In particular, developing and least developed countries have sought guidance on the practical implementation of TRIPS flexibilities, both before and during the pandemic, and have foreshadowed a need for greater assistance in giving domestic effect to a TRIPS waiver. At the same time, many criticisms of the IP system and its implications for public health are not really concerned with the TRIPS agreement itself, but with choices that are made in giving effect to those principles at the national level. And this has led to claims that domestic procedures for implementing legitimate pro-access policy measures are overly restrictive, inefficient, and too bureaucratic. Policy debate and scholarship has primarily concentrated on the international dimension. Still, there's an urgent need to clarify and illuminate how national governments can use the existing and potential future options to address the critical shortfall in vaccine access, both for the current pandemic and for future needs. The Asia-Pacific region, particularly South Asia and Southeast Asia, is a natural focus of technology transfer and manufacturing initiatives, given its relatively well-developed industrial base and its large populations needing affordable and reliable vaccine access. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the vulnerability of Asia-Pacific populations and the strategic need for more substantial vaccine production across the region. And our report examines the extent to which IP protection acts as a barrier to regional production of COVID-19 vaccines in the Asia-Pacific region, and reviews the range of IP rights involved in increasing and diversifying production capacity. As I mentioned, the current literature is really lacking in being comprehensive as well as geographically inclusive in its assessment of the full range of different IP issues in the COVID-19 or public health context, that also take into account the full stock of how TRIPS flexibilities have been implemented practically in a range of Asia-Pacific countries. And so much of the debate has considered the adequacy and effectiveness of available flexibilities, with a particular focus on the patent system and, to a lesser extent, the protection of know-how and clinical trial data. So the scope of other IP rights and flexibilities in a public health context is comparatively less examined, corresponding with a lesser degree of practical experience in reporting at the domestic level. And this limited analysis has contributed to the view that the full range of existing TRIPS flexibilities is limited, and that choices for overcoming barriers posed by a range of different IP rights are constrained. To be sure, some ambivalence about the exact nature and scope of IP flexibilities may mean that they're not fully implemented in domestic laws, or when present in those laws are not being effectively utilised. Therefore, we provide some guidance on the full scope of flexibilities that are available across several categories of IP rights, contrasting the principles that are established under the TRIPS agreement at the international level with the actual practice in a range of domestic jurisdictions. And so this presentation draws on the analysis and discussion contained in the report and summarises the practical recommendations for action that can be taken to reinforce the role of IP within and beyond the TRIPS framework to leverage access to vaccines. And this leveraged access can be achieved through dispersed production capacity or broader access to potential imports, including through regional coordination and cooperation. And the recommendations are grouped according to 5 broad policy areas that relate both to individual national action and options for regionally based coordination. Now, the timeframe for recommended actions ranges from action that can be taken immediately in response to the pandemic to longer-term planning for future resilience and the systemic review and reform of relevant policies, legislation and administration. These more systemic reforms, by their character, are likely to take time extending beyond the current pandemic, but may be driven by challenges faced since the pandemic was declared in March 2020. It would obviously be impractical, burdensome and unrealistic to address the full range of recommendations in a single broad program. And so for this reason, we provide the following indicative timeline, which also serves as a summary of our detailed recommendations. Now, in assessing options for both short-term and longer-term approaches to sustained access to vaccines, policymakers need to consider whether a country or a group of countries is likely to remain reliant on imported vaccines or has actual or potential production capability. Equally, a significant consideration is whether a country has or plans to develop substantial capacity for vaccine research and development. An objective review of these questions would enable a more tailored and nuanced approach to integrating IP law and policy with innovation and access programs that's better suited to individual countries' specific needs and circumstances, coverage. Keeping in mind, the situation will vary greatly across the region from countries that have many applicable IP rights to those that have none. And so this entails preparing landscape studies that illuminate the extent to which the background and foreground IP, especially patents, have been protected in jurisdictions across the region, and considering whether and to what extent test data protection apply to regulatory approval outcomes in jurisdictions across the region. A clearer mapping of the IP landscape may reveal that in certain jurisdictions or regions, IP-related barriers to vaccine access are more hypothetical than real. However, there are obviously considerable challenges in maintaining an up-to-date and accurate analysis of a fast-evolving and complex technology landscape. Now, for those countries that are currently undertaking or seeking to undertake significant research and development, especially if this involves the investment of public funds and resources, appropriate policies may need to be updated or developed to ensure that the resulting intellectual property is managed in a way that meets the public's needs and expectations. And so this entails considering the extent to which each country is investing resources in vaccine R&D or is planning to, and then the degree to which leverage over ensuring IP should be maintained to safeguard the public interest. Now, to undertake this effectively entails meeting the challenge of ensuring the capacity to monitor R&D programs and manage the resulting IP. Now, despite the enormous challenges of the domestic and the international response to the pandemic, there's a positive opportunity for policymakers to assess the adequacy and appropriate balance of IP laws for health innovation and access, in view of the hard lessons learnt during this public health crisis. And so this review process might consider whether the criteria for the grant of patents and other IP rights are well adapted to domestic and regional needs and circumstances, while conforming with the principles that are laid down in international agreements, for example, TRIPS. Also to consider whether suitable exceptions to patents and other IP rights have been included in domestic legislation, with a view to ensuring scope for pre-commercialisation activities such as experimentation, research and regulatory approval. And also to consider whether suitable balanced rules and streamlined clear procedures have been included in legislation providing for use in the public interest of patented subject matter without the right holder's consent. Now, obviously addressing this need is a very complex task. It entails developing and drawing effectively on the necessary technical and legal capacity to review and prioritise different options. It also requires the political will to implement necessary reforms and engage in legislative development. Now, applications for IP rights are assessed, examined, granted and administered under national systems of domestic law. They're not granted and administered at the international level. So achieving a beneficial balance of rights and interests under the IP system in a practical sense is not determined at the international level, but through domestic action, reinforced as needed by enhanced agency of domestic institutions. Therefore, it's critical to ensure that the necessary technical capacity and human capital required for the effective administration and the necessary resources to ensure greater transparency of granted IP rights and applications in process and their compliance with domestic and international standards. Clarity, accuracy and effective functioning of the IP system assists in ensuring that it delivers its intended social and economic benefits. By contrast, a lack of transparency and poorly based or inconsistent decisions on the legitimacy of applications for protection impede these benefits. So without encroaching on domestic regulatory autonomy, there are considerable benefits to be derived from a more cooperative approach to managing the IP system with the support of regional and international institutions. And this can proceed for mutual benefit across the region, despite diverse domestic priorities and circumstances, despite different legal systems, unique bilateral commitments, and varied IP landscapes across the region, as well as a lack of clear best practice models that might assist regional convergence. Now, in the spirit of solidarity, the effective agency of national governments in leveraging immediate and sustainable access to vaccines and other medicine is enhanced in practice through regional coordination and cooperation. So to achieve this entails addressing how to aggregate multiple countries' demands for vaccines in order to enhance their leverage and to be able to create economies of scale, to be able to link the use of IP options and TRIPS flexibilities to pooled or to coordinated procurement, and to make use of regional and international mechanisms to coordinate a cooperative approach. Now, there are potential challenges in coordinating across groups of countries in the region, and obviously the clarity of information about the available mechanisms as well. Now, in the event of TRIPS waivers or further clarification of public interest exceptions under the TRIPS agreement, governments might want to consider how to make use of the additional options that result from such an outcome. And to be able to mark the potential options entails considering the specific obstacles to access and diversifying production that might be addressed by the agreed waivers and exceptions under TRIPS, and specific options available for LDCs in particular, and how countries in the region can best coordinate their use of these options to leverage access, and how to deal with bilateral and regional trade agreements and potential constitutional questions. So the effective use of these options entails addressing the challenges of establishing or clarifying the necessary legal mechanisms under domestic law and coordinating their use across different countries to maximise leverage, the benefits of pooled and coordinated procurement and economies of scale. Now, the option of a tailored, technically focused waiver of specific TRIPS obligations remains a potential future option to overcome identified obstacles, either for individual Asia-Pacific countries or for groups of them in cooperation. And should this need arise, the question arises how to coordinate a position and progress such a request, and what solutions might be necessary to address challenges for access to therapeutics and diagnostics based on experience with the vaccine issue. Now, although the right to request waivers of WTO obligations remains available for any member, there are likely to be perceived political obstacles to making further waiver proposals, as well as challenges for coordinating and presenting a common position before the WTO. So TRIPS waiver proposals and decisions have really focused on introducing, expanding or recasting existing TRIPS flexibilities in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In contrast, little attention has been paid to how these flexibilities in their current form might be more effectively and widely implemented. When leveraged at the domestic level, these options represent powerful tools for increasing local production of vaccines and other essential medicines and improving their availability within nations. When utilised or deployed by groups of countries in cooperation, they open up avenues for reinforcing government agency, for aggregating demand, creating economies of scale, and developing resistance against potential political or industrial pressure. In particular, greater use of coordinated and collaborative access mechanisms would offer opportunities for more efficient and streamlined use of the system for export. And now the 2022 ministerial decision. And so our diverse survey of IP laws within the Asia-Pacific region demonstrated that many existing TRIPS flexibilities, despite being clearly available, aren't being widely or consistently implemented by members. So, for example, a legislative framework for the use of the Article 31 BIS system, while not strictly necessary, is absent in most countries in the region, potentially increasing administrative inefficiencies and undermining the system's potential. So our survey, although partially representative of the full WTO membership, reveals a disjunct between the international principles that are established under the TRIPS agreement and what the actual practice is in domestic jurisdictions. Similarly, the pandemic experience has shown that regional cooperation has been effective in developing technology sharing program, vaccine donation facilities and other programs, but utilised relatively sparingly in bypassing or overcoming potential or perceived IP barriers to increasing production capacity and improving regional and global distribution of essential health products. And so against this background, we've sought to show that discrete legislative and other legal options do remain available for individual countries to achieve public health objectives in times of emergency, and that groups of countries can act together collectively to address the more practical barriers to implementation during times of public health crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. And a round of applause. We have exhausted our time, so I'm looking at the organizers so we can take... I see there are more people in the room than when we started the session, so I'm guessing people are not rushing home. We can take another 10 minutes to wrap up the session. Thank you very much. A very interesting and very detailed report with a long range of options that countries can implement, and clearly outlined that the national level, the domestic level is key, and there are lots of tools and a lot of things that should be done there that could improve a lot, and coupled with regional cooperation could lead to a resemblance of global solidarity. But a little bit of clarification. This report, which was commissioned by ESCAP, is there a corresponding reports or series around the world in other regions, or this is a unique, if you know, of course, a unique sort of enterprise done in Asia Pacific?
Sorry, I might get you to, I'm not sure how to activate my mic. I mean, Matthias might want to talk about this, but this was part of a lab to jab project that was focused on the region. So there were a number of other reports concerning issues to do with vaccine access, but it was focused on the region.
Great. And then you mentioned, medium term and immediate and long term, but it sounded, and of course I haven't read the report, it sounded like these are options out there, and did they lead to actually certain countries or group of countries committing themselves with partners to actually implementing something in the next 5 years, 10 years? Is there an action plan with this menu of potential actions, or is it just early stage? We are not at the early stages, so thank you. But I think those could translate into something if governments agree. And we have Ottoman on the screen. Feel free. I don't see raised hands, but you can. I can see your physical hand in case you have some question or reaction. But as you prepare your reaction, I will come back to Roger from the very beginning. The questions that I had for you, and you partially answered. But on a more general note, what surprised you? I know maybe you're not a person who gets easily surprised with your many years of experience, but was there any moments you said, no, this would never happen, or this would have definitely happened, it didn't happen in the last 3 years?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would say there were not really big surprises, but what I found astonishing is when the pandemic started, that we were all struggling with transparency. That really was an issue. So one would have expected that not only countries but also institutions are much better prepared for that kind of evidence and data. What I think is interesting, and this relates to what we've just heard from Andrew in terms of what is out there in terms of as regards policy options. There seemed to be, I think, relatively limited reflection on concrete and practical use of those flexibilities which existed at the time when the pandemic started. So I'm not talking about the TRIPS decision, what is in the TRIPS agreement. If really a country came to the conclusion that intellectual property constituted a barrier, that reflection, at least at the beginning, I think was sort of not really there. And then perhaps the point which surprised me most is sometimes what you see in the discussions is shall I say, the disconnect between what is discussed in Geneva and what is happening on the ground. I mean, that this sometimes strikes me that there's not sort of a closer connection between those different levels. So maybe this gives you an idea of the surprising.
Thank you very much. I can relate to the disconnect. I moved from Bangkok at the end of 2020 to Geneva. It's a different world. And perhaps, Andrew, I mean, if you have something to reflect as well from your vantage point in the academia, you are in the academia, I suppose, in the last 2-3 years. Any surprises for you or anything that was unusual during these 3 years?
I mean, like I mentioned, I was sort of surprised, I guess, by what the focus of some of the academic literature had been on some of the flexibilities issues, and that this wasn't, some aspects of it hadn't really been considered very much in this report. So it was nice to feel, I suppose, that we're doing something novel, but I was surprised that this hadn't been looked at in more detail before.
Comment?
Just if you do have the time, I'm happy to pick up the question which was on screen.
Which was on screen, if you captured it, and after you pick up on that question, and Ottoman I will give the floor to Ottoman.
He can also go first. No, it's not.
Ottoman, do you want to go first?
Okay.
And we did catch some of your surprises. We noted you were very disappointed with the global response, but something more particular that you want to focus on. The floor is yours.
No, yes, definitely. I just, totally agree with Andrew Mitchell. I think we have not used enough regional institutions and regional cooperation, etc. And I think it's very important because first, when countries act collectively, this decrease maybe the pressures that may happen from industry or political pressure or whatever. And also thinking about, the discussion, and I go back on the local production, it's very unrealistic that every single country in the world is going to produce almost every medicines or medical products we need. So we need to think about this regionally. We need IP issues are never isolated. It is really intricated with other regulatory issues, with several issues, and I think this can be really addressed collectively in a group. Until now, we have been thinking globally or nationally, and I think it's very important to put these issues in the agenda of regional bodies, and I think it's a very good. I'm super excited to read the reports, and congratulations for this work. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Ottoman. Indeed, regional cooperation is a lot of potential there, and I'll pass the floor now to Roger, who seems to grasp the the question on the screen from the audience. Roger.
Yeah, and it's I think everybody can. I don't know if people in the room can see this, but I think it's an excellent question, because you remember on one of my slides I had sort of quoted the data from IFPMA, no agreements involving technology transfer, and not only from IFPMA but also from other sources. Not saying that this is the absolute truth. This is the data I've taken from different publicly available sources, and is actually the question which is asked here is pointing to a challenge which we regularly face when we talk about technology transfer. What does it actually imply? A simple fill and finish sort of assistance, so that you can repackage or reproduce, as it says here, some of the production. Is a possibility, but then of course you have more advanced technology transfer agreements, which in the best of circumstance leads to full transfer of the technology that is required to produce the vaccine or medicine in an autonomous fashion. Now, this said, to really have precise data about the degree of technology transfer in each of those agreements is very difficult to obtain. We did provide more detailed analysis to the TRIPS Council at some stage with the help of Affinity, the provider which I used for the situation in Thailand, because they have access to a more comprehensive set of data. But even that doesn't give us the full picture, and I think we can just conclude by saying genuine technology transfer, well, there are various degrees of technology transfer, but to really say, out of 92%, 10% were sort of genuine tech transfer is amounting to almost the impossible and would require some study. Maybe, that's something, Andrew, on the academic side, this is a topic one could take up and sort of carry further in that sort of research work.
Thank you, Roger. And I think we have someone eager to take the floor, please.
Thank you. My name is Chalamsak Kitakun. I'm working for Thai Network of People Living HIV/AIDS, and we have do advocacy work with the Thai governments for a long time to promote access to medicine. As Roger mentioned in his slide about the molnupiravir in Thailand, I would like to provide some more information as well. That is not, we have to do a lot of things before we can get molnupiravir available in Thailand. At the beginning, MSD did not give us the VL at all. Thailand is not included in that MPP license. But after that, we found it out, the molnupiravir has been filed patent application in many countries, but molnupiravir is not a new drugs. But what they want to claim for, they claim for the use of to the treatment of COVID-19. So it's an opportunity that the big pharma make use of it to get the huge benefit of that, rather than to promote access to medicine. So that is the question for the civil society. We have a movement, have the dialogue with the government that we're supposed to do something. And we try to find the patent opposition on that, and like in many countries. But anyway, later on, the MSD decide to extend their license to cover Thailand. But anyway, they have a condition. Molnupiravir that we buy from India is gonna provide for the state hospital. That's subsidized by the Thai government, but not the private hospital. It means that the patient that attend to the private hospital, they have to pay out of their pocket by buying the original molnupiravir, not the generic one. And as the price show, original one that they sold to Thailand is about $200 per treatment. But for the generic version, it's only $20 per treatment. So it's quite very clear to me that the big pharma try to make use of this opportunity, COVID-19 pandemic, to make a huge profit rather than to promote access to medicine. And for the molnupiravir, we have to say that it's not 100% funded by the drug company, but it's co-funded by the public money, by the US government to do the R&D for that, for another purpose. But later on, it has been a potential to treat COVID-19, so it's really purpose to treat COVID-19. So I think this kind of incident showed me that the IP system doesn't work well until now. And even COVID-19 pandemic is like a spotlight putting on the broken system of the IP, that we have to do something, news, like have some effort in the WTO that by the South Africa and Indian government try to propose to have the fifth waiver. But anyway, at the end of the day, many original intention has been amended and removed out of that. At the beginning, fifth waiver supposed not to be only patent, but it's copy at that type, another form of the IP as well, like the copyrights, and also the trade secret, something like that. The intention is try to promote in the other country, developed country that have capacity to produce vaccine and that medicine as well to help address the issue. That's why so many people die of COVID-19 in the past 3 years, because vaccine is limited at a certain group of country, particularly the rich country that have the purchasing power to buy the vaccine. And at least people in the poor country just died. Even we have the vaccine, but they can access. So we have to open up this kind of messy system to allow the other people who have capacity to produce vaccine and medicine and distribute it to the poor country as well. So I don't quite disagree with the idea that how we can get the benefit out of the current IP system, but we have to make something new, have to change the system to make it a better balance between health and trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting additional information about the case of Thailand. So it's interesting to know the various other considerations, and we hear you. The system is not perfect and it doesn't work for all circumstances. And yes, and again we heard that countries have a lot of instruments at their disposal, and this is where civil society like you can bring their voice to shape the dialogue. If we don't have any other hands, I did have another general question at the beginning, but perhaps it will go into other sessions tomorrow. It's perhaps a question to all of us from all we're hearing and all we're learning. Is this time going to be different or not, or a little bit different? Are we going to make at least incremental change? Are we going to move ahead, or are we going to stay in the same place? Sorry if it's not too optimistic, my tone, but it's late. Thank you very much for the panelists, both online, Ottoman, and the gentleman from WTO, Devin, that had to leave us. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Andrew, and see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ottoman, Professor Andrew, Dr. Liviu, Dr. Roger, and Dr. Devin. You have certainly given us a lot of information to think about into tomorrow. Thank you again. Okay, may I remind you of tomorrow's sessions? Session 3, we will start registration at 8:30, and the session 3 will start at 9 in the same room. Please join us. Thank you. Have a good night. I'm sorry, may I draw your attention to the screen for 1 minute? We have evaluation form. We would highly appreciate it if you could scan and do the evaluation form for us. Thank you so much.
you.